Juneteenth, Emancipation Day, Liberation Day, Freedom Day. The triumphant day we were supposed to move closer to a more perfect nation where we're all equal. But tonight, there's still more work to be done.
The calls for police reform, fair voting rights, and equal economic opportunities are growing louder. So how do we bridge the gap? With the Orlando Economic Partnership, we want to dig deeper into how race and culture shape Central Florida. You're watching an Eyewitness News Town Hall, Race and Reform in Central Florida.
We want to thank you for joining us for this important conversation. If you think racism doesn't impact you, you're wrong. This matters to everyone because racism not only impacts the mental health of African Americans, it also impacts our regional economy. Good evening, I'm Vanessa Eccles.
And I'm Greg Wormuth. We're going to try to cover a lot of ground in this next hour, so let's dive right in. We have assembled an impressive and very diverse panel of local leaders from every walk of life for what we hope will be a candid conversation. You'll be hearing from them throughout this next hour.
But before we can look forward, we need to see how we got here. Central Florida has had its own share of racial unrest and injustice.
And some history was kept hidden for years, surprising even people who've lived here for generations. Channel 9's Darlene Jones walks us through some of Central Florida's darkest days.
The growth of Black independence flourishing in the early 1900s throughout Central Florida didn't sit well with some white people. The racism still boiling from the institution of slavery led to the revival of the KKK, with deep roots in our local communities. They were empowered to lead a massive rally in Orlando ahead of the 1920 presidential election, an effort to intimidate African Americans who simply wanted to vote. It led to the Ocoee Massacre, white mobs rushing to the rural community, burning down all of the Black-owned land, forcing every Black resident out, killing some, lynching July Perry. Segregation remaining prevalent through the 40s, penetrating housing, schools, and jobs. Most African Americans relegated to rigorous labor work in citrus groves, creating wealth for white families in Orange and Lake counties. Those groves lured the Black men we now know as the Groveland Four, falsely accused of raping a white woman and assaulting her husband in 1949. The local KKK killing one of them. Lake County Sheriff Willis McCall later shot two others, killing one. Their case caught the attention of Harry and Harriet Moore in Brevard County. Mr. Moore writing to state and federal government leaders demanding investigations. Then on Christmas Day in 1951, he and his wife Harriet were blown up in their Mims home. No one was ever charged. These are the injustices that make up Central Florida's racial history, an estate home to the first Black settlement, Fort Mose, and where emancipation was proclaimed on May 20th, 1865, a month before African Americans across the country commemorate emancipation of enslaved people in the U.S. on Juneteenth.
A powerful look back at Central Florida's fraught civil rights history. So let's talk about that and look ahead to the future. We're joined tonight by State Representative Geraldine Thompson from District 44, State Senator Randolph Bracey, District 11, Professor Rudy Darden with the Peace and Justice Institute at Valencia College, and Eddie Moreton with Lift Orlando, a nonprofit dedicated to revitalizing the historic West Lakes communities. The first question is for State Representative Geraldine Thompson. You're quite familiar with Central Florida's civil rights history. On this celebratory day for so many, what is your message for those familiar with Juneteenth and those who may not know about its significance even today?
My message is that America has been on a journey toward equality, and our founding documents indicate that all men are created equal. But even when that was written, it was not true, because women were considered property. They were chatteled on by their fathers and later their husbands. People of African ancestry were counted as 3/5 of a human being. If you were not educated, even if you were a white male, you were not equal if you did not own land. And so we've been on a journey toward freedom. You can imagine in 1865, years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, when people learned of their freedom, they were jubilant. They celebrated. There was singing and dancing and oratory, and that is what Juneteenth is all about. And the last of the slaves who got this news were in Galveston, Texas. They got the news on June 19th, 1865, and they then knew that they had been freed, actually, based on paper, more than 2 years earlier.
And so that's where we stand. And that's where we stand with Juneteenth. That's a great history lesson for us. Thank you very much, State Representative.
Juneteenth is now a federal holiday. Thursday, President Biden signed a bill that Vice President Harris helped introduce in the Senate last year.
By making Juneteenth a federal holiday, all Americans can feel the power of this day and learn from our history and celebrate progress and grapple with the distance we've come, but the distance we have to travel, Jim.
It's the first federal holiday approved since Martin Luther King Jr. Day was signed into law in 1983. But states don't have to recognize federal holidays. So what does that mean for Florida?
Let's now move to State Senator Bracy, and you were pushing for Juneteenth Day to be a state-recognized holiday, given the political and racial divisions we've seen recently. A question, do you see Juneteenth becoming a holiday in Florida?
Yes, I do. And I'll just say that as the sponsor of the Juneteenth bill, we were able to pass it in the Senate. We also passed May 20th, which is Emancipation Day in Florida, when the slaves found out in Florida that they were free. But it was a situation where the House did not want the legal holiday. They would prefer a day of observance. And so it was that negotiation on the last week of the session that we couldn't come to an agreement. But we were very close to putting that together. And so I don't see why we cannot do it. But it was the Senate that had to force the House's hand. But I think I can bring it across the finish line next year.
So we're talking about history. Let's go to Professor Rudy Darden. What have we learned from our history that could help address our current problems?
And I know I could talk about like the ways that we've signed laws into place and the ways that we've seen what many have called progress. But when we keep seeing what we see and we keep hearing the silence, we hear a little bit of like the tenor going up, the volume going up, but there's still no action behind it, because what we're really saying is, do you really value someone? And to the degree where I've seen that we haven't yet learned how to really value people, and I'm not just talking about people of color, I mean just women, people with any kind of ability challenges. Just when we learn how to value people and we can learn from our history on ways that we didn't value, I think we have a step moving forward, because if we could just stop that stuff,
absolutely,
that'd be a pathway forward.
I think all of us can certainly agree and get on board with that. Let's move now to Eddie Martin, the Lyft Orlando Executive Director. How do you work with business leaders and residents to strengthen some of the most underinvested and deserving neighborhoods in our region, Eddie?
Well, the realization early on for us is that the phenomena of urban concentrated poverty is not an accident. It's not something that occurs on its own. There's a very clear history that creates these environments, and the reversing decades of disinvestment required first prioritizing investing. So for us, we invest in people, amplifying the voice of residents, the most valuable asset in any community. Invest in places where they live, learn, work, and grow. How do you create environments where it's easy for people to thrive? And invest in the partnerships that accelerate that prosperity. The trick is holding in tension all of these resources so that they can work in collaboration. So we use 3 ideals to do that, and we remind these often. Every partner, board member, and person that collaborates with us, one, that what you do for me without me, you do to me. And when we forget this, even our best intentions can do more harm than good. That if you are to do for me, that you should never do for me what I could and should do for myself. So empowering the voice and leadership of those who live in the community to do what they can do for themselves. And then when we are going to do for others what others cannot do for themselves, we should do it as if we're doing it for ourselves. So whether that's high quality housing, early childhood education, or public parks, we want to elevate the standard of living for those living in the heart of 32805, so that they enjoy all the blessings that the beautiful city of Orlando has to offer.
That's well put, and that's what Lyft is all about.
We have a lot to discuss, as you can tell, this evening. When we come back, we're going to talk about an issue that really has been in the forefront over the past year or so, and that is police reform.
George Floyd's murder 1 year ago prompted protesters to demand police reform and social justice across the country and right here at home. Channel 9's Darlene Jones with a closer look tonight.
The tears begging for equality were already flowing when America heard the ugly cry and demands that led to the biggest social justice fight since the civil rights movement. George Floyd's murder reopened a deep wound lingering in the Black community toward law enforcement. The demands for change penetrated our local police agencies, forcing many to revisit and, at the very least, talk about use of force policies. In the middle of it all, Tallahassee Melvin, an Orlando man, was shot in the back while running away from an undercover Orange County deputy, further angering a community still raging from other high-profile police killings nationwide. Breonna Taylor and Rayshard Brooks. Locally, protesters questioned the officer's story that Tallahassee Melvin turned toward him with a gun while running away. The biggest difference between the civil rights movement of the 60s and now is that far more people of all races are demanding equality for all, not just nationwide, but right here in Central Florida.
So where do we stand a year later when it comes to police reform and accountability?
We're joined now by U.S. Representative and former Orlando Police Chief Val Demings, State Senator Randolph Bracey, State Representative Geraldine Thompson, and Isu Mayad, Orlando Magic Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. What a great panel for this discussion. Let's begin on the national level. First to Representative Demings. So far, partisan disagreements have prevented any comprehensive police reform bill from passing. President Biden has said he wants to see reform. So, Congresswoman Demings, will it get done? And if so, how?
Well, let me just say it's great to be with you. And, you know, this is an issue, as you've already indicated, that we have been dealing with over a year now. I really would like to see the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act passed. We got it passed in the House. And what we do know, if we just take a moment to reflect, it's certainly unforgettable. What happened to George Floyd was brutal, it was senseless, and it was murder. The persons responsible should be, and as we all know, are being held accountable. And so the legislation, while it is not perfect, I do believe that it is reasonable. We're looking at establishing a national database, looking at hiring policies. We say that police departments should reflect the diversity in the communities that they patrol. We're also looking at training to make sure that police departments throughout the nation, regardless of their size, have training, certain training standards. And also looking at policies like banning chokeholds and neck restraints of any kind, also no-knock warrants in non-violent cases. And so, as you know, the negotiations over the legislation, after we pass it in the House, it's in the Senate, the negotiations have continued. We're all hoping, while it's an up and down journey, I am not ready to give up on those negotiations or the people who are involved. I am hoping that we will be able to come to some resolution, get this first step passed, and then continue to work on additional legislation that might also keep our communities safe, but also give law enforcement the tools that they need to be able to effectively keep our communities safe.
So let's move from there to the state level. State Senator Bracey, at the state level, we've seen some police reform in Florida. Children under 7 can no longer be arrested in most cases. Chokeholds violate policy unless there is an immediate threat. There's now a duty to intervene in the case of excessive force and medical emergencies. Those are some of the wins, but there are many changes that did not get approved. Tell us why, and how do you push for more changes in the future?
Well, thank you for that question. And I was the Senate sponsor for that bill and the main negotiator with the House to get that bill passed. And as you mentioned, banning chokeholds, we call the Kaya Roll Act, prohibiting 7-year-olds from being arrested. But there's also independent review of police shootings. There's de-escalation training in there. So there's a lot of good things in there. But you're right, it did not go far enough. And it's because of the police's influence, the Sheriff's Association. They have a tremendous influence. So I think there's only a certain amount that they were willing to go. And so we still have to look at limiting no-knock warrants. We have to require body cameras when officers are on the street. We have to stop officers from taking cell phones away when there's misconduct happening in the streets. We have to reform qualified immunity, which shields officers from being sued for misconduct. So there's so much more that we can do, but I'm glad that we were able to put that first step together and put a bill that passed this year in the legislature, and I was happy to be a part of that.
Let's move now to State Representative Thompson. And is there enough being done, in your opinion, on the state level to ensure that police officers are punished for excessive force?
Well, one of the things that was rolled into the larger bill that Senator Bracy just talked about was one of the things that I advocated, and that was a database that would be managed through the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and indicate and capture by individual law enforcement officer and by agency where there were excessive complaints of undue force. And by having that database in place, we would be able to see where the hot spots are. We would be able to require additional training in unconscious bias, for example. We would be able to provide discipline, which could mean suspension up to termination. It would stop officers from moving from one jurisdiction to another, because not everyone has the temperament or the personality to be in law enforcement. But we've had people who were terminated, decertified in one county, and moved to a different county and became a law enforcement officer. One of the things that we can't fix is what we won't face. And if we won't face that these are problems, then we won't fix them. And so we have to be able to identify the problems. Derek Chauvin, who knelt on George Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes, has a second home in my district in Windermere. In Minnesota, he had 15 complaints of excessive force. If there had been a database, this would have raised a red flag, or should have raised a red flag for someone. And so I was very pleased to see the database rolled into the larger bill that Senator Bracy was able to shepherd through both chambers, the Senate and the House.
Very good. Thank you for that. And again, as we talk about database, just keeping track of those who are bad actors so that they can't move, and continue on with that. What about voting rights? That's next as Eyewitness News dives into race and reform in Central Florida.
Since the November election, 14 states, including Florida, have passed new voting laws. Supporters claim the laws are needed to safeguard our elections.
Now, while critics charge the new laws are aimed at one thing and one thing only, suppressing the vote, is that really the case? State Representative Camilla Brown, who represents District 45, joins U.S. Representative Val Demings and Professor Rudy Darden from the Peace and Justice Institute at Valencia College. Vanessa, for our next question.
Representative Brown, you've called on corporate America to get involved and speak up against laws restricting voting. Why is that so important?
Thank you. I think because they're a part of the community, and the health of our community and our state actually impacts everyone, including them. What we have seen is many of these companies and organizations have been funded, are funding many of the folks that are the leadership that basically have gone rogue. I feel it's important that many of our corporations stand up for a strong America and a strong Florida. And I think that if they want to be considered good citizens, they have to step in a different way. What we have seen is many of the tokens and the gestures, and all corporations have the social responsibility, but giving to our youth, those things are great, and they're appreciated and needed. But I think the thing that we need now more so in today's society, in a post-Trump era, I think that each corporation has to do more.
Let's find out more about that. Representative Demings, earlier this week, you introduced a new voting rights bill in the House. So conversely, what would your bill do, especially here in Florida, where state election laws were changed in Tallahassee? In fact, that happened just this past session.
Well, look, as my friend and colleague said, the late John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, he said the right to vote is almost sacred. And so I think it's absolutely shameful that Florida is one of several states now that are doing everything that they can to suppress that vote. What we introduced is the Everyone Has a Right to Vote Act this week that would create a system to electronically track ballots. We've seen some shenanigans, as you noticed, this year where it involves ballots, keeping up with the ballots, things that are happening with the ballots. And so that is extremely important. We're also requiring every county within the United States of America to have drop boxes available. Why are there efforts to make voting more difficult in this country? We know that there are people who, many of them, I talk to them every day, who are working 2 to 3 jobs. So the drop boxes are so very, very critical. But the third provision in the legislation would deal with alternative ways, working with the Elections Assistance Commission to identify alternative ways for signature verification. We know that the older we get, the chances are greater that our signature will change. And so it's all about creating a process that protects election integrity, and that will allow every person, regardless of who they are, how much money they have in the bank, the color of their skin, to be able to exercise the right to vote in a country that we say is the greatest country in the world.
Let's bring in Professor Rudy Darden now. Do you think Florida's recently passed election law will suppress voters?
I think any effort that now has been passed, specifically the kind of language that we have been dealing with at the university and college level, where we now, as educators, have been spoken to from our lawyers around the impact of what this legislation means for us as professors in our classroom. When we talk about how these laws impact voting, we know that the next group of voters and the way that we have a system set up for when people turn 18 and they have this now right to vote, there's something strange, I think, around the way that we are all watching legislation push through that says people like college educators can't really teach the kind of history without fear that somebody's going to turn on their cell phone to try to record and try to say that, hey, look, this is something that may be out of context or within context. And there's just so much gray. There's so many areas that's just not yet clean enough for at least us as educators to cause us to say, wait, what has just been passed at its core is hitting right at our voting. The very thing that makes America great in terms of our democracy is at risk, and we see it. And it's strange that we're seeing it and we're allowing it to go the way that we know history has taught us leads us to the kind of destruction that we see in our country playing itself out right now.
All right, Professor Darden, thank you.
And as Professor Darden mentioned there, this is an important issue for all communities, but in Central Florida, the business community is also very concerned and monitoring the way that we all react to these issues. We'll be back as Eyewitness News continues to delve into race and reform in Central Florida and how it can impact the bottom line.
You're watching an Eyewitness News Town Hall, Race and Reform in Central Florida, with the Orlando Economic Partnership. Welcome back. A region's potential for future growth and success hinges on tackling racial inequality.
And in order to build a better future, we have to start early through educational programs. We also have to create more economic opportunity for the Black community.
One longtime business owner told Channel 9's Karen Parks how his persistence paid off.
It was 1994.
It takes a tough person to own a business in the Paramore community because you're out here by yourself.
Jay Henry said back then his struggle was real.
I had an opportunity, I had the location, but I didn't have any money. I just got out of the drug treatment program.
He came up with a business plan and faced scrutiny that was clearly written on the wall.
We had to go around in circles about having 3 televisions in the barbershop. And I had to make it perfectly clear to the person that I was talking to that I'm not going to take the televisions home.
Jay Henry's barbershop was finally on track. Then came the soccer stadium, dirt roads, blocked off streets, obstacles which almost shut him down.
Oh man, I robbed Peter, the pay Paul. I still owe John, and all of us needed Jesus.
And for Jay Henry and others that looked like him, financial assistance was hard to get.
So we're not asking for a hand out, we're asking for a hand up.
He says the red tape when applying for government assistance made it not only intimidating, but just plain hard.
My white counterparts have people that look like them in place. And a lot of times, we, in some cases, don't have people that look like us in place that could dot our I's and cross our T's for us.
Finally, he has connections in place that taught him how to play the game. Decades later, Jay Henry stands strong.
Appreciate y'all, all right?
Perseverance, he says, has paid off.
Thanks, man.
Well, there's a lot to talk about in this area. We're joined now by Tim Giuliani, Orlando Economic Partnership President and CEO.
And also Dr. Barbara Jenkins, Superintendent of Orange County Public Schools. Let's begin with Tim. So, Mr. Giuliani, what action has the Orlando Economic Partnership taken to advance economic opportunities for the Black community, and how is progress measured?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Over the last year, as the pandemic has affected so many businesses, and like we just saw in this segment with Jay Henry's Barbershop, we worked with over 400 minority-owned businesses to help them through the process to understand who was lending and who was doing PPP and how do you apply and how do you get your documents ready to make sure that they survive the pandemic. We've also worked with another 400 companies on skills-based hiring to make sure that more people had more opportunities provided to them and that employers weren't creating artificial boundaries where maybe that was something of the past. Re-looking at job postings and job descriptions to make sure that more people could apply. And then as far as measuring, we've worked with the Brookings Institution, the Polis Institute here locally, and other partners to really look at all of our economic data as a region, whether it's wages or employment or small businesses. And we've now broken it down by race, by ethnicity, by gender, so that leaders in our community really know exactly what the economic picture is in every category in our community.
And Tim, to follow up with that, what unique programs or incentives have been created to offer greater opportunity for disadvantaged areas in Central Florida?
Yeah, two come to mind, a little bit different. One is the Lift Orlando program that has been here in our community for several years now, and a lot of business leaders, not only of our organization but of others, have worked hand in hand with residents, great leadership from Eddie Moreton, to really look at the West Lakes community and really reverse the trend of disinvestment by creating more investment, whether it's healthcare, it's education, it's houses, it's access to jobs. And so that's a block by block, mile by mile exercise that is starting to pay dividends in our community. And then the city of Orlando has been the first to replace a incentive program that used to be offered by the state to be offered locally, but with a twist. It's more focused on neighborhoods, whether it's through hiring or the location of the business that's adding jobs, they can receive incentive. So we're just early in that program. We've only had 2 companies submit so far. They're expanding and creating jobs in our community. And the more they hire from the neighborhoods that need the economic opportunity the most, the more of an incentive that they'll get in this performance-based program.
All right, Tim, economic opportunity is one thing, educational opportunity is another. Let's turn to Dr. Barbara Jenkins. The academic achievement gap between minority and disadvantaged minority students and their white counterparts is a real thing. So, Dr. Jenkins, how has OCPS addressed this gap?
There are a few areas that we have concentrated on to address the gap, and I have to say, for the last 5 years, we've seen significant gains in the gap between achievement of a graduation or high school diploma. What once was a 20-point gap between white students and Black students, African American students, has now shrunk to a 9-point gap, but that's not enough. We'd like to see 0 gap between those groups. So OCPS has done a few things. First of all, I am thankful for a board that is very well focused on equity issues and on making sure every child has a promising and successful future. That is actually the vision that we hold here in Orange County Public Schools. So we have a Minority Achievement Office that will push and drill down for students so that they have opportunities, because quite often the achievement gap is an opportunity gap. So we make certain students who should be in AP classes but don't have someone requesting it or offering it to them, that based on the data they are placed in those classes and then supported so that they can be successful. Our MAC, Minority Achievement Office, does something called the Calculus Project that purposely identifies minority students to push them into STEAM careers and into STEAM college majors because they actually get through to calculus successfully in high school. We know that's critical if they're going to be successful in the STEM areas. And then Oak Ridge High School has the JA Academy for Leadership and Entrepreneurship. So young people like future Jay Henrys can actually come in and learn the principles of business and of how to start their own business and to be successful. Our CTE program has wonderful programs for our children that help them lead into college or career pathways that would be lucrative. From welding to modeling and simulation, we want our children to have opportunities. And the focus has to be intentional on those students of color and students that have been underserved to make sure they are supported to succeed, because we know that they can be successful.
And education is such an important component in all of this. Here's something interesting to consider: where you live, how that accounts for perhaps the opportunities that you will have. We're going to delve into that when we continue with this Eyewitness News special, Race and Reform in Central Florida.
Where you live can have an enormous impact on how much opportunity you have.
Channel 9's Janae Broom spoke with a prominent local researcher who examined the disparities in our local neighborhoods.
The data says very, very clearly that in the United States and here in Central Florida, we continue to have a very serious problem with structural racism and structural inequality.
Dr. Bahia Maroon's Polis Institute has analyzed Central Florida's 1,700 neighborhoods to evaluate the disparities and opportunities for the people who live there. They crunched the numbers on health, housing, unemployment, education, safety, and economic opportunity, all to create the Neighborhood Opportunity Index.
Over 85% of neighborhoods that do not have equal access to opportunity are also neighborhoods that are primarily populated by African Americans, Hispanics, people of color.
The data also shows the enduring power of history. Many of the areas dealing with those higher rates of poverty, crime, and unemployment today are the same places where Black people were forced to live during segregation.
The legacy of segregation, the legacy of unequal access is affecting today's children in the 21st century. And as a community, I know that we can do more and we can do better.
Dr. Bahia Maroon from Polis Institute is with us tonight. She's joined by Dr. Damian Thomas, sports curator at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and Tim Giuliani, Orlando Economic Partnership President and CEO.
So let's begin with you, Dr. Maroon. How do we break down and move beyond the silos of geography, industry, and business? Why should it matter this much what your zip code is?
I think the most important piece to understand is that silos of industry and geography, these silos actually enable racism to flourish. And so when we're dedicated to overcoming racism, we know that the solution is very straightforward. It's about placing African Americans at the center of decision making for those initiatives that are designed to genuinely create equity and empowerment in our community. And it's so wonderful to know that here in Central Florida, we're already seeing some of the fruits of what it looks like when you place African Americans at the center of sharing power and sharing decision making. We see this at the Orlando Economic Partnership with the BRACE program. We see this at Lift Orlando with the work that they're doing in the communities of West Lakes, focusing again on place, on people, on partnership. So when you empower the people most affected by structural racism to be at the center of overcoming structural racism, you're well positioned to actually make a difference.
And Dr. Thomas, what national models have you seen that change the path for communities in these vulnerable zip codes? Dr. Maroon mentioned it. It seems like Lift Orlando is certainly one of them.
Over the last year, we've seen a number of corporations and entities promise to take action to help deal with some of these problems. One of them that really stood out to me was something that Netflix said that they were going to do. They're going to put 2% of their cash into Black serving institutions. And I think that's a really significant program. And I hope that other organizations decide to do the same thing, particularly those big corporations that are rooted in our communities. And it's important because when you put money into banks, the banks are often able to loan multiples of that amount. And so it creates an outsized economic resource. And so I hope that we see more corporations continue to follow that model outlined by that corporation.
And Tim Giuliani is there to also encourage businesses to do that. He's back with us. And Tim, compared to the national average of 18%, a child born in Paramore has just a 2% chance of reaching the top fifth of the income distribution. Now, across the street, not far in College Park, that probability of the same economic progress is an alarming 28%, quite a bit greater opportunity. So how can there be so much disparity between two adjacent neighborhoods, basically across the street from one another? And how are we working in Central Florida to change that?
Yeah, it's a really amazing statistic that hits you between the eyes. Part of what we're doing with our prosperity scorecard is going company by company and really taking a deep dive so that they can understand what these numbers look like and how drastic. You know, your zip code may mean more than your DNA, more than your genetic code as far as your prosperity in life. One example that I think just resonates, it's access. And if you depend on transit in Central Florida and you assume a 30-minute trip to work, if you don't have a car and you rely on transit, you have access to 5,000 jobs. If you do have a car in that 30-minute trip, on average, you have access to 500,000 jobs. So this is an access challenge. And when you look at all of these companies that are looking to hire, and in some cases having difficulty, you know, our economic future really relies on more people having access to the economy. So it works both ways.
That really gets to the heart of what we're talking about here. When we come back, we're going to talk about something that you've probably heard about, but you might not really know what it really means. We're going to talk about DE&I as this Eyewitness News special continues, Race and Reform in Central Florida. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. We're all hearing more and more about it in the workplace.
So we wanted to dig deeper into why and talk about ways people can take real action. We're joined by Leonard K. Spencer, Director, Supplier, Diversity and Sustainability, Disney Worldwide Services, Inc. Also, Isu Mayad, Orlando Magic Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, and Tony Jenkins with Florida Blue. Vanessa?
So, Tony, you've been a pioneer in equity and inclusion efforts here in Central Florida. How have these initiatives gained momentum recently?
We have such an opportunity to create a more equitable, fair, and just society. But it's going to take all of us to get involved and to get engaged. And I'm so proud of the work that the Orlando Economic Partnership has done, where we, together with not only the business leaders, but we have linked arms with community leaders as well. And we have come up with what we've called a pledge, a DEI pledge, diversity, equity, and inclusion, where businesses and leaders may know they have the passion to help get engaged in racial and social equity change, but they may not know what to do or how to do it. And so this pledge walks them through the steps on items and actions that they can take. So I'm very encouraged by the work that the business community is doing. There's more work to be done, but we're on a path, in my opinion, to help create the community that we're striving to become.
Very good. So let's go to Leonard now at Disney. A lot of the conversation around diversity and inclusion is centered on workforces, you know, the employees. But you mentioned before we went to air that Disney actually would like to go further. Leonard, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, you know, I'd love to elaborate. When companies think about their diversity and inclusion strategies, they usually start with their employees, which is reasonable. They look at their recruiting, their hiring, and creating a sense of belonging where their employees work. But we believe a truly inclusive company is going to go deeper. They're going to embed diversity and inclusion in every aspect of their culture, making sure that they're looking at their entire business through an inclusive lens. And this is going to include their employees and their work environment, of course, but it's also going to include their customers and the businesses that they contract with in their supply chain. Because just as workforce diversity is important, so is having a diverse supplier base. The economic impact of supplier diversity is significant because it supports jobs and wages in diverse communities that contribute to broad-based prosperity in the community. But from a business perspective, diverse suppliers also bring innovation and new perspectives that help companies delight their customers. They support a culture that better reflects the diversity of the individuals and the families who make up a company's customer base. And they help make certain that a company is not only in its community, it's of its community. And I'm happy to say that Disney's Supplier Diversity Program has been around for almost 30 years, creating long-standing partnerships with diverse businesses right here in Central Florida. Because we know that just as our employees bring the benefit of their unique stories, their experiences, their talents, their cultures to our theme parks, our resorts, our studios, and our campuses around the world, so do our suppliers. And we know this diversity is going to enable Disney to better service our guests, our audiences, and our fans, while also recognizing that magic that exists in all of us.
So let's bring in Issa Mayat. How does a more diverse workplace strengthen a workforce?
Yeah, thanks for that question as well, and thanks for this important conversation this evening. At the end of the day, it all matters when we take a look at the business from a holistic standpoint, as Leonard alluded to. Essentially, workforce diversity, supplier diversity, the efforts that the business or the organizations are making in the community to align with equality and social justice issues, to align with improving outcomes in that community. All of that adds to establishing a meaningful value proposition in diverse markets, in diverse communities that says, look, we believe and we know that there are people from all walks of life in every community that have the ability to do business with us if we have the audacity to establish a very meaningful value proposition with them. And in that way, it's all connected. It's all inclusive, and it's part of making sure that we don't just look at diversity, equity, and inclusion as the right thing to do, as we used to say, but it's also important and necessary and fundamental to the way the business operates. It's tied and connected to the business model of the organization.
And so there are some important tools and resources that can help you, your organization and company to help take steps forward for more positive progress here in Central Florida.
So how do you get started? Well, here's one way to do it. Visit WFTV.com. Right there on the homepage, you'll find links to the Orlando Economic Partnership's Corporate Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Pledge. More than 150 companies across Central Florida have already signed up, including major companies like Walt Disney World, Advent Health, Orlando Magic, and yes, WFTV. We want to see this list of employers taking the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Pledge grow even more. It can only mean positive progress for our residents, workers, and companies all across Central Florida.
Now, signing the pledge is the first step. Then you can begin to take action by using the Business Toolkit. This new tool gives step-by-step guidance on implementing programs and initiatives that help educate and communicate best practices. This 90-day toolkit is easy to use and offers a variety of options and action steps.
So how do we know we've made progress as a community? Well, the partnership has developed an Orlando Regional Prosperity Scorecard that tracks economic performance and community development progress. This scorecard includes a Neighborhood Opportunity Index developed in partnership with the Polis Institute that helps raise awareness of challenges and can help guide priorities for our community. You'll find links to that pledge, the toolkit, and this important scorecard right there on WFTV.com, or you can go to orlando.org/DEI. Keeping score is important in a lot of elements in life, and in this one, it's super important.
Taking some action.
And ownership.
Yes. We want to thank all of our panelists and all of you for watching at home, for joining us for this Eyewitness News Town Hall, Race and Reform in Central Florida.
We thank you for joining us for this important conversation. Hope it will make a difference in your life and our community. Have a good rest of your night. Take care.
Good night.